that message that drew them?
Well, I'd say there's two primary ingredients there. You have to have an experience that's worth inviting somebody to, and then you have to have people that are willing to invite. We had those two things. We had an experience that was worth inviting somebody to, and there were probably all sorts of things about it that made it worth it, but it was authentic. We talked about real issues. We weren't weird about it. We met in normal places that weren't intimidating. We didn't waste people's time. We lived out as best we could what we were talking about. So those are some of the elements. So it has to be an experience that's worth inviting somebody to, and then people that want to invite. So we talked about invitation a lot. So that's a real simple answer to your question. I think churches that grow basically are experiences that are worth inviting people to, and then they have people that are willing to invite.
So do you have to train folks then how to invite?
You know what? I really don't think that you have to do much in that. I mean, you can spend a lot of time training people, and I think that training is good. But I think the bigger issue is that fundamentally a lot of our churches are not places that people want to invite their friends to. That's the bigger issue than not knowing how to invite.
Some sort of closet embarrassment about it?
Sure. I say some of our churches, and I say this because I love the church, but some of our churches are like family reunions, like we go there. And we love these people, we understand them, but God, we never want to bring our friends to it. I mean, I get that sense a lot about churches. So I'll go to churches, and they might have 4, 5, 6 young people in their 20s, and I'll gather them together and say, tell me about this church. Well, we love it. I sing in the choir with these people, but I don't think I'd bring my friends. And it's not that they don't know how to invite, they're not going to invite them to that. Mm-hmm. But U2 was in town last night. Biggest concert in the history of St. Louis, over 50,000 people. They don't have to train people how to, invite. I mean, people want to go see it. It's compelling. You go to a new restaurant that opened up on your block and it's really good. The restaurant doesn't need to train you how to invite other people to join you. I mean, we know how to do that. You say, hey, I ate this great restaurant. You guys want to go there next week? So I don't think invitation's actually all that hard.
So that's the initial network that helps build the community. Now you bring along some other resources to do that, to facilitate that.
Sure.
Web resources, other media types of resources. What are you doing, and what's working and what isn't?
So that's a good point. So I have this assumption that we pour a lot of energy into making sure that the community is the kind of community people would want to invite their friends to. And then we give people tools to invite. So it's a little bit like teaching, but what we try to do is, for example, somebody cannot invite a friend unless they know what's coming up in the future of the church. And so you have to give people something to invite their friends to. And I think what we fail to do a lot of times in the church is to give people things to invite friends to that are actually directly related to what we care about, like worship and service and mission and education, or whatever the things are the church cares about. Let me give an example. We'll have a big barbecue. I see, churches will do these outreach events. We're going to have a big barbecue, invite your friends to the barbecue, we'll have a jump house for the kids. 100 extra people come, they eat food, jump in the jump house, it's a great time, they leave. The church goes back and says, wasn't that great? We had a barbecue with 200 people. But then there's nothing that happens after that until the next big event comes around. What we want is we want people to invite their friends to worship. We want people to invite their friends to small group. So the question becomes, what are you doing in your worship that is worth inviting people to? And how are you letting people know about that and offering them the tools so that they can invite a friend? So let's use sermon series, for example. I preached the lectionary for a while, and I preach series now a little bit more. Series are nice because they offer an invitation point, I call it. Now we have two natural invitation points. They're called Christmas and Easter.
Sure.
I think one of the challenges is how do we create other invitation points throughout the year? So instead of saying to your friend, I'm really excited, this is, fourth week of ordinary time. You need to come to church with me. That's not, nobody's going to come to that. But 2 weeks ago, we started a new series called Forgive and Forget. It's 3 weeks on forgiveness. What is forgiveness? How do we practice it in our lives? What do we do with anger and revenge? 3 weeks before the series starts, we give people cards. We email blast a postcard. We put things on Facebook that they can share in their profile and send to their friends. And we say in 3 weeks we're going to be starting a new series on forgiveness. And that turns into an invitation point. So that on July 10th, 2 weeks ago, we had record attendance at the church in the middle of the summer, a time when a lot of churches shut down. We had record attendance. It was the beginning of a new 3-week series on forgiveness. So what it does is it turns just another Sunday where we're just preaching another sermon about another thing with some songs, and that's great, but it doesn't give people something specific. Instead, it's, hey, I know that you're going through a rough time right now in your marriage, your husband had an affair. These are the real life issues. People come to my church in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about forgiveness and what we do with anger. Or, hey, I know you're having a rough time at work. This gives people something to invite people to. Mm-hmm. And then they do it. That's the amazing thing. So you put the tools out, you ask them to do it, you give them something to invite friends to, you make sure that it's something compelling, and then you ask them to go invite. And the cool thing is they go and do it.
One of the knocks on megachurches, which you're quickly growing toward, at your size, in mainline denominations, you'd be considered a pretty large church with an average attendance of 700. One of the knocks on megachurches is that they're very fundamentalist, they're very black and white, they're very much directing people's lives. I don't get a sense of that here. I was downstairs in your Sunday school room and saw a book by Marcus Borg. This is not something I would find at my local Baptist megachurch.
Right.
Talk about that for me.
Sure. Let me hop outside of my role as pastor of this church and just as a colleague and friend of people in mainline denominations that might be listening to this. And I speak about my own tradition, that I grew up Methodist. I've heard all that before, and on the one hand, I just want to say I don't think that stuff is true, really. I mean, it's easy to demonize the megachurch, the fundamentalists, they direct people's lives. I'm friends now with some people that theologically I don't agree with, that have very large churches, and I've just not found I've not found that stuff to be true. So I think those are narratives we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel better that we have small churches that aren't working. So I just feel like that's an important thing to say. Now, to the extent to which we do come from a different theological heritage, sure, churches can grow under all sorts of, theological teachings. I think what's important, though, is that you do have to, each and every day, each and every week, as a pastor, find increasingly clear ways to articulate your theology, whatever it is. People appreciate clarity. They appreciate direction, whatever that direction is. The opposite of direction is sort of directionless, and that's not good. So I do think that our challenge is to be clear, to be direct, to articulate our theological perspective, whatever it is. And we've certainly seen here that a church that's not fundamentalist can grow, and can grow rapidly. I do think, though, that we have a lot of churches that the problem isn't that they're not fundamentalists. The problem is that they're just not fundamentally very clear about what they believe, and they don't have a great way of articulating it to people in a way that they can understand and apply. So, but I hear that constantly, that if you want to grow, you have to be fundamentalist.
What's your mission statement, your vision statement here?
To create a Christian community that's compelling for new generations in St. Louis, which, as I was telling the story, was basically what I wanted to do in the beginning.
And so there's got to be some bullet points under that. To do that, we do.
Yeah. Well, I talk about our vision as being what we think makes this church unique. There's 54 Methodist churches in the area, St. Louis County, St. Louis City. And what makes us unique is we really are trying to reach new generations, create a community that's compelling. We're very creative, so we're constantly doing new things here. We filter our ministry in such a way that the question we ask is, what would be compelling to a person in their 20s or 30s? Now, we have people of all ages, and one of our fastest growing demographics is 55 to 65-year-olds. But when we make decisions, what we think about is new generations, college,
And what
through
is
about
compelling?
30s.
And how does it make it shape in worship as well as in program?
Well, I'll give you an example. When I sit down to figure out my preaching schedule for the year, I lay out my sermons about a year out, so I know what I'm preaching on for all of 2011, part of 2012, and I'll take input from people who are here. I'll take input from people who aren't here. I'll sit down and read scripture and really think about my own devotional resources. And then when I come up with potential preaching topics, and this is true whether you follow the lectionary or you do series, then I ask the question, okay, if I'm a 25-year-old guy, single, hanging out with his friends, looking for a girlfriend, beginning a job, what does that guy want to hear, need to hear? What's the gospel mean for him? And out of all the stuff that's on the paper, I pick this one because that's what I think is going to be most compelling. So, compelling does include an element of relevance. There's a thoughtfulness with your audience in mind, and so that's an example of how we try to make what we do compelling to new generations. So that's something with sermons. Let me use a different example. The color of the paint in the foyer. Something really basic. I go into some churches and they say, we want you to come and speak about how we can reach younger people. We're going to meet in the parlor. Well, nobody knows what a parlor is. Who's under the age of, whatever, because we don't have parlors anymore. Nobody calls anything a parlor. And then I go into the parlor and it looks like a parlor. It's got furniture from like my grandmother's living room, which is lovely. I love my grandma and I love her living room, but nobody I know puts that stuff in their house. So when we do a space, for example, we think, okay, what kind of space is compelling to a 25-year-old? And that's how we create the space. So that's just two examples, one kind of silly, one when it comes to preaching on what I think compelling means.
But fresh paint and a guitar and worship are not going to change that.
Not going to do it. It's got to be holistic. It's a holistic approach. So I know churches that'll say, for example, well, this stuff we're willing to change, but there's this whole other body of things that we're actually not going to be flexible on. We don't want to recreate that with new people in mind. Well, if you're unwilling to do that, it's unlikely that your church is going to reach new people. It really has to be holistic.
So that's why you have a new church.
That's right.
In an old building.
Yeah. Incidentally, I think it's possible with existing churches too, but it's a great act of boldness and courage to recreate your ministry in a holistic way. Yeah.
This is a class that's looking at evangelism. What do you want to tell seminary students? You've been out for a little while. You're having some success. What do they need to know about what evangelism is and what it isn't?
That's great. Well, when I teach on evangelism, I love John 1. I think John 1 is worth reflecting on. I think it's worth reading, especially with that question, what's evangelism look like in John 1? And what do I mean by that? Can I grab my Bible?
You sure can.
I'm going to do that real quick because we can just take a look at it. John 1...
Pull it off your iPhone.
I could have done that as well. But,